Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this new deep dive in which we're going to be talking about Progressief Nederland, which translates to Progressive Netherlands, which used to be called GroenLinks-PvdA, which is Green Left Labour Party. And this is currently the biggest opposition party in the Netherlands, and also most likely the only left-leaning party we'll really discuss within this series. So what I'm going to talk about today is, given that it is a recent merger, I'll talk a bit about the two parts it consists of before, which were Labour or Partij van de Arbeid. I'll be using the Dutch and English most likely interchangeably within this video. And then after that, I'll talk about GroenLinks or Green Left. And after that, I'm going to talk about the period where they worked together. So this is pre-merger, when they were sharing a lot of things, which is when they were called Green Left Pay van Labour or GroenLinks-PvdA, which was between 2023 and 2025. And after that, I'll talk a bit about the merger when they've been called, Progressief Nederland, kind of like the new party and how things are going there. So let's just then give a bit of context. Like I said, this is going to be the most left-leaning or the only real left-leaning party that we're going to be talking about in this series, because it's the biggest coalition party and the other parts are relatively small. So the two people here of note also are, of course, Frans Timmermans. If you like the EU, you might already know him, Mr. Green Deal. And then we also have here Jesse Klaver, who also is going to be important, from respectively Labour and Green Left. So let's start with Labour. So Labour is, of course, it's quite typical and generic in the sense that if you have a Labour Party in your country, this is most likely that Labour Party. So it used to focus really on like laborers or people who are, poor, who have it bad. And in the status quo, as a consequence, they use a lot of like older voters. The reason being that, of course, when it used to have a lot more industry in the Netherlands. So, you have more people actually doing more hard work, you have more factories, all the kind of stuff. But we have transitioned more into a service industry in which things like banking and things like, more informational employment is more important. So things like consultancy, things like they need a higher education for rather than something that's actually manufacturing. And as a consequence of that, the kind of voters that they have are still people who voted for Labour out of kind of like habit or because they're kind of like older from the generations where they've seen Labour be in power and do things that they've done. But it isn't as big on the newer voters who are younger, maybe a bit more higher educated. Doesn't mean that they don't have people voting for them. It's just statistically it is lower. So it's kind of like the focus group that they have. So people who are not doing great. And the policies that they kind of go for are also quite generic, just left-leaning Labour stuff, right? So it's kind of like have a bigger welfare state. So this means spending more money on education, making healthcare more accessible, making the higher wage higher for individuals, have the state intervene more in companies, so maybe break up monopolies, giving more relations with unions and that kind of stuff. And the kind of like slogan that they have translated directly to English, something like the strongest shoulders should carry the heaviest loads, something along those lines, just to kind of like explain what they're going for. It's kind of like an old party, which also means that they have a lot of networking infrastructure based around that. So, for example, they have a lot of like connections with unions. They also have oftentimes as a party, they have more like elderly party members and like advisory councils within the party, which are also from those elder members. So there's kind of like already well positioned party. And this is basically just the Labour. So I think if you think about like the normal Labour standpoints that you might have from the UK or anything else, then this is kind of what they would stand for. I wanted to talk a bit about the history of the Labour Party because I think this is important to really understanding not only Dutch politics, but also to understand how people view Labour. So it started really as a fusion party that really was created after World War II and consists of basically left-leaning parties that existed before World War II. So this just happens in the Netherlands. Oftentimes you just have parties basically being created, as mergers. It's quite normal, as you see from the previous videos that has happened before. And basically, what they did after the war, you had what was called Rooms-Rode coalitions, which is the coalition that you have between the left and between the more religious parties within the Netherlands, and it kind of like laid the foundation of the welfare state. So in the Netherlands, historically, you had kind of like three groups of parties, which is one left, then you had kind of like right, and then you had kind of like the religious parties. And this coalition between the left and the religious parties basically laid the foundation of the welfare state. So these are things like pensions, like investing really in education. Of course, it was after World War II, so it was like rebuilding projects, all that kind of stuff. And there are a lot of things that they basically worked on that are a lot of the foundations that we have right now. And that is kind of like, when they started into getting power. Then after that, it took quite a while for them to get into power again. So after that, you had a lot more coalitions, which were more between the right and between the more religious parties. And then it's only after like Kabinet Den L, which is the last left-wing coalition party that we've had, like coalition that we had in the Netherlands. So like full left-wing, not like with coalition with the right or with conservatives and that kind of stuff. So this Kabinet Den L, so the cabinet of the guy called Den L, this the person that you see here on the slide, and that was between 1973 and 1977. And this was again also where we put a lot of like the main things that we have right now. So like for people who don't have a job, make sure that they have money that they can fall back on. It was really good for also for elderly people, all that kind of stuff. And I think this is always quite interesting. You would think in this time period that this cabinet would spend a lot of money and they would basically do what Labour did maybe, and they spent way too much money and it was basically really bad and really bad investment. But actually, this was what we had like called a closed budget. And a closed budget was basically when you had as much income as what the spend has would have spent. So we didn't actually create any deficit. And the only other time this happened was with the purple cabinets, which was way later. But it kind of like shows you also a bit of the context of the Dutch political history, which was that you want to become like fiscally responsible. So you don't want to spend too much as the state, which is something that the Netherlands still tries to maintain and tries to do, right? So we still now do spend more money than we get in. So we are having a budget deficit. But when you look at EU and what kind of standards we want to set to other countries as well, we are lower in that budget deficit, but also we also criticize other countries within the EU if they spend too much money and they are going over the budget deficit and they are doing too much. So that is kind of like something that has happened historically, but also something that is still going on right now. But I think this is kind of interesting because you would think perceptually this is very left leaning, but they're spending a lot of money, but that's just not the case. Then after that, basically the left had quite good repertoires. They had a quite good perception amongst voters. At some point between the next coalition, so between the purple cabinets, which is in 1989 to 2002, there were actually times when Labour did really, really well. It was even the largest party, like getting like 50 plus seats, but still was not part of the coalition. Basically, just the right and the conservative, like the religious parties, did not want to work with Labour together. And that's kind of like why they haven't been in power for that long. It's kind of been a bit blocked. And I think the reasons was just political disagreements, wanted to do other policy, all that kind of stuff. There's any like a big structural reason I could give you, but it's just kind of like why the left has not been in power. It's not necessarily that they weren't popular, it's that they kind of like were not popular enough that they need to be taken into account for a coalition after Cabinet Den L. Now, what that we then get is then this was the last left-leaning coalition. Then we get two coalitions with other parties. So this is the purple cabinets. So this is from 1989 to 2002. And I think here the image of Labour really got like poor. And the reason is just that during the elections, they oftentimes were very left-leaning, right? So very focused on laborers, focusing on like poor people, all that kind of stuff. But then when they actually got into the cabinet, then they did really, really poorly. What they basically did is they just did a lot of like right-wing policy. It got so bad that basically at some point one of the VVD'ers, so it's like a right-leaning party, said at some point that the Labour head basically did like that he couldn't think of a way to better push through the VVD and the right-wing policies as Labour has done within that coalition. So there was just a big disconnect between what the voters wanted, what they needed. And then there were a lot of things within the purple cabinet which happened quite well in the sense that economically the Netherlands was doing well in this period, and also as a consequence because this was a coalition with the left and the right, and there weren't any conservative and religious parties involved. A lot of policies were pushed through that are quite progressive. So this looks like, for example, euthanasia. This looks like things like gay marriage. All of these things got passed because they didn't have religious parties within the coalition. And basically before that, almost always religious parties within coalition. So this was basically quite a long time in which there was basically just uh a purple cabinet left right, where basically the left really screwed up their image. And as a consequence, this is also actually when Pim Fortuyn came up. If you don't know who Pim Fortuyn is, basically he was a very populist right wing, and actually properly right wing populist who's anti-immigration. So basically, already during the Purple cabinets, Labour and the VVD knew that people were worried or were getting worried about immigration, but actively kind of ignored the signals that they got from the electorate and rather focused on the economics policy. And they were thinking, look, we're doing economically well, so therefore we should get re-elected again. But Pim Fortuyn really saw that there were people getting worried about immigration. So he took kind of like a very harsh stance against that. So he was also quite, right wing. So it was very like, neoliberal, low taxes, don't have much in the state, which is very different from, for example, Geert Wilders, who is, currently maybe the figurehead you would say as the anti-immigration politician in the Netherlands, was also very anti-immigration. In that sense, it was the Pim Fortuyn, but actually is way more left-leaning than Pim Fortuyn. And basically, this kind of like led as well to a big downfall within Labour. Pim Fortuyn capturing the people who were normally voting Labour, which are like laborers and poor people, he got them with this anti-immigration policy and this anti-immigration rhetoric. So that is basically why also the purple cabinet kind of like fell, like in the end, that the left wasn't, taking into consideration again for the next elections, and they really did poorly in the next elections. Then we basically have again Labour coming in. This again is Rutte 2. Mark Rutte, so you might already know, this is VVD. So this is again a coalition between the left and the right. And this is between 2012 and 2016. And basically here a similar issue happened where Labour really, really gave in a lot of things. And it was again a very right wing coalition, or a lot of people felt like there wasn't enough done for the poor people, for the left wing voters, all that kind of stuff. So again, twice people are kind of like burnt about this. So this is why Labour has always been kind of like in an iffy spot. It's basically they used to have a lot of old voters for whom they did a lot of good things. So we didn't actually have a rebuilding of our welfare state since Cabinet Den L. Like we didn't do any real big progressive things. So like giving students money so they can get education, making like a lot of healthcare accessible and parts of it free to people, creating a pension, anything that's like giving money to people who are like poor, all that kind of stuff. Actually, all those things that were built up within either roughly the 50s or the 70s. And since then, they haven't been built up or new things have been introduced. And it's all been done by Labour. But the issue has been that this has been very long ago, and every recent success that they've had has always been with the right, and they have compromised too much, as well as the changing economic sectors and changing of society as a consequence, meant that the kind of group you would normally get to vote for you actually did not vote for you because they vote either actually to the to like nationalist parties, so something like Pim Fortuyn or recently the PVV, or you would lose against even the VVD. So people went from left to right because they just felt that left wasn't doing enough. So that is basically just a context of the Labour Party, and also then why they would want to merge. Right, they're doing quite poorly because of this. They've been up and down in election. They haven't really been able to get their highs as they had been before. Now, then Green Left. Green Left is a bit of a more boring party to talk to in sense of like what happened historically and election wise, because they're relatively recent, right? So they kind of like are a merger in 1989, where they used to be kind of like a merger between parties who were communist, pacifist, and kind of like evangelical, but like very left leaning. So they were even more left leaning than the socialist party that we had. So they've always been the opposition party. So they've never been in any coalition, which kind of makes them a bit boring to talk about because you can't talk about, oh, they fell down, this, that, but they've always been able to just do a lot of opposition. And they've been critical. And of course, Green Left. So green, things like, make sure ecologically we're doing everything okay, nature's being protected, and left, so left leaning and all that kind of stuff. So they used to be really left leaning, and over recent years that has become less. So I think they're less left wing than the Socialist Party that we have right now. So they're much more, I wouldn't say center left, but they're more left than Labour, but they're definitely also more right than the Socialist Party. The only thing that I kind of want to say is of note is a climate law that they passed in 2019 with Labour. So they were kind of like a big thing that they pushed for, and it's basically just the climate law, like the Climate Act, which basically said that the goals that we had set, so for example, specific goals for the amount of nitrogen or CO2 and all these kinds of like things that we had that we signed treaties for, these also now become actually legally binding and that kind of stuff. And this is of note because again, as you note, they have never been in the coalition. So this happened as an opposition party. And basically, they've been able to get this law passed by both support of the left and the right. And they proposed this law together with Labour to kind of like get this through. And that's kind of like the main thing that's off note election wise. And if you want to characterize people, it's really like climate. So yes, it is green and left, but the overtone has always been climate. Like I said, it used to be more communist, but basically since the 2000s, they've been less communist, and they've been a bit more just like they've been drifting a bit more to the middle of the left right divide. So more of the still left progressive as I've explained. So then what are the things they talk about? They're oftentimes just very focused on nature, putting in, for example, meat tax, protecting natural areas that we have, not building too much, but also progressive. So, anti-discrimination. And kind of like the way to understand who the people are that are taking part in this party is just highly educated, young, left-leaning people who are very progressive. So people who, for example, fear about climate, people who are also very anti-discrimination. So you think, for example, just like maybe a debater that who's quite left-leaning and very worried about like climate change, and since the debating we're already quite progressive, so it's kind of like woke and all that kind of stuff. That kind of person most likely is people who we would see also at GroenLinks. So it's a bit younger, but as a consequence, it's also a bit more. Um, it is younger, which has been able to catch attention. It's less of the older generation that they've been able to get, which also means that you get a specific kind of person. So they also get perceived as a bit more radical. In general, people who are younger tend to be a bit more radical in the political stances, partially because they have a bit less to lose and a bit less things that are stable for them anyways. So they don't have a job, they don't have a car, they don't have other things, a house they need to focus about. And oftentimes people tend to vote a bit more on those kind of like practical matters because those, affect them directly. And those are the things that matter to them most and affect them in their daily life. And they're often those consequences to be less ideological. Whereas if you're younger, you tend to be a bit more, not only you have less things to lose in that sense, you tend to be a bit more ideological because you can afford to be. You have more time to think about these things. You have more time to be worried about these larger things, as well as your brain isn't maybe as fully developed, so you're also maybe a bit more susceptible to some aspects of like more extreme ideology and like more activist ideology, where you might paint a picture as quite black and white of a very clear good and very clear bad, and might not look at the specific nuances of a policy and how it affects and might affect different people. So that's also like, yes, they're young, they're enthusiastic, all this kind of stuff, but it also brings the generic faults that you have as a consequence, which might be not put like thinking about all these policies through exactly. When it comes to the young people supporting them or the kind of policies that they would want to be pushed, also maybe being off-putting to the general public as a consequence, because there are going to be a bit more radical than people who are going to be, on the ground, who might worry about other things, as I said, with the housing and a car and all that kind of stuff. And therefore, that is kind of like a description of that group. So now we have two parties, and basically they already start working together for the 2023 election. So basically, there still were two different parties. So you had the Labour Party and you had Green Left, and what they had is they had a shared list of candidates, a shared fraction in the parliament. So when you would be voting and you'd be discussing, they would just all be like together, one block, and they would have like one party program. They kind of like work together. However, they still had separate organizations. So you had your own members, your own congresses, and it's also partly because you have also, of course, the party working on different levels. So you have it on national level, they have it on provincial level, and they have it on municipal level or like city level. And there might also be disagreements between the left and Green Left and the Labour Party. And then, they didn't want to merge completely just yet for that sake, because you also had these different elections coming up. So basically, we're just working together and see how it went. And basically, they just had all of these things quite separate. So on different levels, you might still have different levels of cooperation. Some municipalities they also work together. Sometimes they didn't work together. So that's why it's always a bit messy. But basically, they were just already working together. So the main context, again, here was both parties weren't doing that great, right? Before 2023 election, Labour only had 9 seats. And that was just because what we talked about already, right? So they wanted to focus on the workers, but the workers, they've been losing to kind of like, the right and immigration policies and all that kind of stuff. And they're kind of like fell off because they weren't really trusted of the coalitions. And then you also have Green Left, which had 8 seats, again, more ideological, but also because they've always been in like opposition, never really trusted to, actually put anything through, maybe. And it's always a bit of a question. Yes, they have been willing to actually, be in coalitions, but they've never been able to be considered because they're too left wing, right? So if other center right or center and right wing parties are basically big, and you kind of need to work with the VVD is not going to be like, yeah, we're going to work with the Green Left. Maybe other parties like D66 will be willing to. Maybe CDA. CDA is an interesting question whether they would want to work with Green Left, given specific questions of what policies they would want to give in, etc. But basically, it sometimes would feel like a thrown away vote, which is also why they're maybe on 8 seats rather than higher. So that's why they work together. And as you can see, it worked quite well because in 2023 they got 25 seats. Okay, so that's the kind of like context of the 2023 election. What happened? So they were really, really big. However, what happened is you got instead a coalition that was quite right wing. So you had the VVD with the PVV and the Farmers Movement and other parties. And this is what I said before, which is we have a video about this already in more detail on the channel. But this is basically the left was basically locked out. So then in the 2025 election, the idea was to again stop fracturing the left. So the idea was we're gonna work again together. We're gonna become so big that they would need to be considered for a coalition, right? And the main thing is again who votes for them is just still mostly highly educated people who tend to vote for them. And the policy that they went for as kind of like a merger is quite intuitive, right? Because you have two left-leaning parties. So both of them want more education. More of them want more money to healthcare. Like both of them also care about the environment. So there isn't really major disagreements on policies. So it's kind of like the general policy you would get from things. So they're kind of like not necessarily they're not anti-immigration. So what they would say is that they would want to follow Spain's Spain's deals that they have with African nations, where they basically have rules and treaties with these nations about sending back immigrants who are kind of like deemed as going through the process and saying no, we don't accept you given the standards that we have, or you don't fulfill, for example, the what we require for like you for the visa or for as a refugee, all that kind of stuff. So it still wants to tackle immigration, it still wants to talk about it, but it doesn't have like the strong anti-immigration narratives that the right has, or even kind of like the thing that D660 talked about, where they kind of like just try to copy a bit of the right, make it a bit more fit into the policy and the legalistic framework, and still make it a big point. It's more of a they have a solution for this, but as you can see, it's also kind of like a quite technical response. It's not a we need to stop immigrants. It is we need to follow the path that Spain has done with these treaties so that we more efficiently are going to get rid of the immigrants that we've already denied access to our country, which is, again, like I said, a bit more, I don't want to say rational because it sounds like a very kind of vague, but a bit more specific framework, right? A more framework of based on reason, based on like what is working, based on politics, rather than maybe emotions, as the right has tried to do some of these anti-immigration policies. Also, in general, they're pro-EU. And kind of like what they want to say, we build more houses. They want to get more money for education. They want to hire the minimum wage. They want to like make also sure that the pensions are going to increase in like value and that kind of stuff. And these are kind of things that they focus on. So just green left, and also of course, as you can see here, there's already a bit more economic to focus on, but they do also have climate policies. So they do also want to protect nature. They also want to have specific reforms that will make it that some companies who are, for example, killing animals for like the meat industry, butchers and that kind of stuff, will have to basically pay specific kind of like taxes and that kind of stuff to discourage them from creating this meat and all the kind of stuff. Like there are other policies they have for nature and ecology, but mainly it has been focused on economy. So it's kind of like if you have the divide, it's kind of like maybe 60-40, 65-33 percentage between them. Now, who's then leading the party? Well, for this election, Frans Timmermans was leading the party. And if you like the EU, you might already know him from the European Commission, where he worked at, and he's called Mr. Green Deal because he's been pushing for a lot of like green policies within the EU. He's also a very seasoned politician. So he has been a minister. He has, for Labour, he's been elected multiple times. So he has like a lot of experience, which again might speak to the more educated people because they also see him as like someone has a lot of experience, very reasonable, and also he talks a bit like a politician. So this is something that you can see. Like he talks, for example, quite firm, and sometimes he can be quite strong, but he always tries to be calm and reasonable. So he can use emotion in his voice, but he's never emotional, if that makes sense. And sometimes in like some discussions he might become harsh, but overall he tries to still seems like calm and reasonable person. However, as a consequence, he also, because he's kind of like a seasoned politician, he can sound like a bit too political, right? So not directly answering the question, or kind of like answering the question based on like legalities and politics and all that kind of stuff, rather than emotions, which is again attractive to some people, right? So the highly educated people who are voting for the party anyways are most likely attracted to this kind of reasoning compared to maybe the more emotional reading. But it also means that the people that you might want to win, which are win back, are the people who are going to go to the PVV and VVD or want more stronger emotional policy, maybe on immigration. You're not going to win because of the way that you're speaking and the way that you're presenting yourself. And again, people just make a shot decision, right? So the average person kind of like sees him on talk show, sees him on TV, maybe discussions, maybe on like the news, and sees how he talks about these kinds of things, and thinks maybe this is just not the person for me. He doesn't speak the way I want him to speak. He doesn't talk the way I talk. He doesn't speak to my emotions, whereas other politicians do. And I think that is the way why he's kind of like in that sense, a specific kind of person that works for some people but doesn't work for other people. Okay, now, what then happened after 2025 election is basically we got the results, which you can see here on the right. So we got D66 becoming the large party with the PVV, so both on 26 seats, which is why we have the current prime minister being Rob Jetten from D66. Then we have the VVD, who went down, but not a lot. So they went from 24 seats to 22 seats in after 25 election. But Labour, Green Left, so the coalition that they formed together, the group, the Green Left Labour Party, they went down from 25 to 20, which is not good enough to basically be so big that you would have to be part of the coalition. And as you can see, there's a minority coalition that's happening between D66, VVD, and CDA, where GroenLinks-PvdA basically got ignored in that sense. Not because they didn't want to, right? Because they tried during coalition talks to say, hey, we really want to work with you. But it was specifically the VVD who was saying, no, we don't want to work with GreenLeft-Labour because they're too left-leaning. That's basically what it boiled down to. So Frans Timmermans kind of stepped down as a consequence. And now we have basically a new leader, is Jesse Klaver, who basically has been the former leader of GroenLinks since 2015. So also a bit of a seasoned politician, still younger, and also like in his perception, especially in the beginning, he seems kind of like a more younger and up-and-coming politician compared to maybe, Frans Timmermans, who obviously looks older. And Jesse Klaver was able to make Green Left actually quite big. They went from 4 seats to 14 seats, and basically has been, during his time, at some point, of course, they fell down afterwards again. But he's been very clear that he's been kind of like a young, highly educated, kind of like critical opposition. So there are some of the things where he's like opposing policies and maybe going directly against wielders, and those things become viral. So he's been kind of like a relatively well-known opposition figure and also leader, and has kind of like as a maybe a downside to this person is maybe somewhat limited executive experience in the sense that yes, he has been part of parliament and he has done opposition work, but he hasn't been, and the party hasn't been anyone who has actually had any experience in the form of like being part of a coalition, actually pushing through the policies, getting things done. Yes, they've been able to get the climate act through, but that's maybe the exception rather than the rule, right? So it's very different. And of course, he has been the face of like the Green Left and is not very representative of laborers. So again, right, he's young, he's highly educated, he is a climate activist. So there's a specific kind of person that he is that doesn't necessarily speak to the people who are laborers or who are usually voting the Labour Party. So that's kind of what happens with that working together. It's kind of like complicated, but now we're just going to get to what the party is as you'll see it now if you look it up and if you're going to see the news. And it's basically just Progressief Netherlands. Basically, in 2025, they had a vote in which 88 to 89% of everyone who's like a member of the two respective parties was in favor of merging together. This was after they already had worked together and after they already had been campaigning and platforming together during the election. So this is something that came after. And only in 2026 it came through, right? Officially, like they're now one entity. And the reason for that is, again, very practical. You have on a municipal level, so on city level, you sometimes have parties that they form that, you have the two parties. So you have GroenLinks and PvdA. And sometimes they just had too much differences in the kind of policies that they had, or they already have been campaigning in a specific way. And also this again happened when some of them were already in power, so they were incumbent, and then the other party maybe wasn't, they were in the opposition or something like that. So just to not have a complete headache with that, they decided, given all this context, the next election, so for the municipal level, we're still going to keep them separate. So we're not going to be a completely merged party. However, what we're going to do is we're going to, after that, so people can also plan and also, campaign accordingly for the election after that, they will merge because then they will be one entity. So that is basically the kind of like the logistics of this thing. So that's been voted in. Just that a very big group of people really, really wanted this. And this is, kind of like showing maybe the boss side of this, but also this hasn't really been without any friction. So again, as I've been characterizing, you have two groups, right? Labour, older voter base. I'm saying more conservative. It's not that they conservative instead of like gay rights or any kind of stuff, more in the form of like changes that they want to implement. So they're more piecemeal kind of party. So they have also more trust in specific structures. They also have they're more embedded in things like, for example, unions and all this kind of stuff, which means that they have more trust in that system and work more through that. And also maybe, again, elderly people are more like listening to older party members and kind of like experienced members and all the kind of stuff. They have more in the party focus on those parts of the party as well. And they focus more on inequality. So like the economic policy, whereas the Green Left is more young. So they don't have, for example, these links with unions, but they actually have with climate activist groups. And instead of, they don't have as much of a structure where there's a big importance to kind of like party elders and like party people who have been long at the party giving advice on all the kind of stuff. They're also a bit more radical, right? So they're more young. So if you think about your young climate activist friends, they are more likely, to be like, part of this party. And that is why, there's also going to be friction between the old people. And there's also, again, like I said, more focus on the environment. There's always going to be discussion, right? So are you as a party going to focus on one group over the others? So are you going to focus maybe on the young people over maybe the older voter base? Are you going to focus more on economic inequality, or are you going to focus on the environment? And these are direct ways, by the way, right? So if you want to build, for example, more houses to help more people get a house, this means that you will have to build in places that you might alternatively want to protect in the form of like natural areas. Or all the emissions that come free from those projects might mean you don't get specific goals, or you want to maybe be a bit more restrictive. All of these things have direct trade-offs. And that is where like there might be discussion within the party, and there is a lot of like things that need to happen where you make sure that there is consensus internally about what you're going to do and whether everyone has satisfaction with that. And you don't get half measures. Because we do have a housing crisis, so you do need to solve that. But we do also have a climate crisis, and we have intensely hot summers right now. How do you solve this issue? Now, what are then the disagreements that we have within the party? It is the following. It is the fact that there was a question about the stance against Israel. So, of course, not surprised, the Labour Party was more adjacent to Israel and also Jewish organizations within the Netherlands. So they were more hesitant to actually create embargo on Israel for weapons. And the older party leaders kind of like didn't want this. However, the younger generation, of course, is already more pro-Palestine, and therefore had more of a wants to push this more through. So they wanted to actually get this weapons embargo that they go for, and more critical of Israel, all the kind of stuff. But in the end, they had a vote on this, and the party voted yes, that they were going to have a more critical stance. Is also something that's now in their election campaign, and the weapons embargo is something that they're going to stand for. However, as a consequence, some of the older members of the party, I think three or four of them, have actually left the party as a consequence. And there's, of course, still kind of like a dissatisfaction of the other older members of the Labour Party who were not in favor of this policy. Then, like I said, there's just other things, right? So it's like the goal of the party, to which group are you going to focus on? What policy are you going to focus on? But also kind of like an election list. The last election that was in 2025, there were quite a lot of like labor or at least labor topic adjacent individuals on the list. So, for example, there weren't as many climate activists who were on, the list of people who can vote for, and they weren't in high enough positions. Again, maybe to give a bit of context, in the Netherlands, you vote for a party, but you get given all the names and a list, and these are kind of like ordered. So the first one will be the party leader, and then underneath that will be other people. Now, the main thing is that if you get a specific amount of votes, you get what's called a preference vote. So if you, for example, let's say you only get enough votes to get 8 people into parliament. But let's say a person who's on number 9 has way more votes than the person who's on number 8. They might go up in the number, and instead the person who is like 8th doesn't actually get through. So that's kind of like the way that you can vote in Netherlands. So where you are on the list matters. If you are high enough, again, most people how they vote is they go down and be like, okay, I'm gonna vote. I know this person maybe, or from the list who's on top, this person a bit more on climate, or this person is a woman, so I'm gonna vote for that. And that's how they vote. So they vote on that, and then they look from down to low. So if you have people in high positions on the list, that matters for who is likely to get in. You still have opportunity to vote for people who are climate activists to go in eventually, but they will have this extra hurdle that they would have to go through. And that's also something that they have been disagreeing on. So overall, so far, there is just a question of how this will look in the future. So far, they haven't been able to become big enough to really become part of the coalition. And the question is this kind of like going to sustain, right? So you have these disagreements that might happen because of the different people, because the inherent traits need to happen. Like you can't focus on all these things together, and you have like different people who are in the party. So is this going to be a sustainable party in the first place? But also, this might be a question of what kind of policies are they able to go through? Will this maybe be too watered down? As a consequence, will parties split off? Will you basically then just get again just like a slight you get the Labour Party and then you get a new kind of like jump off like a new ecological party or nature party that would jump off, and that will just create kind of like the same situation that we were before, which means that the left's going to be fractured. All of these, I think, are uncertain right now. There is enough agreement within the party that it isn't very clear that they're going to fall apart, right? So this isn't something like Labour in the UK where there's like huge fights on like, do we trust the prime minister? Different interests, are we going to go more to the left because we need to fight, the Greens coming up? Are we going to fight the right because anti-immigration policy? Like it isn't as intense as Labour there in the UK, but there is a question how sustainable that relationship will be and what the future will look like for this party. Okay, that was basically all that you need to know about the Green Left, GroenLinks, Partij van de Arbeid, Labour, and Progressief Nederland or Progressive Netherlands. If you have any questions, please let us know or let me know in the comments, and I'll respond to that. And then see you in the next video. Bye.